Um, so
Good.
I want to let you know that this will either be the last or the second to last lecture in the series on rising inequality in the United States. And obviously, we've been talking about this for rather a long time. I know that there are other things happening politically, and we have digressed upon occasion to look at them, but I think you are ready for some more current events. And so I will be turning to that next week, or well, I'll do my best to get there next week. Now I'm seeing Mary has her hand raised. Let me just go ahead and unmute you. Mary, what would you like to ask? Mary, can you hear me okay?
Let's get started. Don't
okay.
start with these.
I agree. Let's get started. Mary actually doesn't seem to be there right now. So I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody. And as you, I'm sure, recollect by now, all you have to do is hold down in your space bar and you can unmute yourself and ask a question. So as I was saying, I'm going to transition back into contemporary American politics with you in the coming weeks. But for today, I do want to cover a theme that I have promised that I would cover for a very long time. And that is some of the policy approaches to coping with and beginning to address the rise of inequality in America. Now, I can't do that all at once, and I do have some unfinished work to do with you from our previous lecture. And so, as I say in the title, I'm going to talk about objections to inequality and then what to do about it. So moving from reasons to reject inequality to policies to combat it. Those will be the big topics for today. And I'm just going to refresh your memory very quickly. Last week, we were discussing together a book by T.M. Scanlon, Why Does Inequality Matter? And that's our final philosophical work on this topic. One moment, sorry about that. And I do want to finish out that discussion and then get into two stages of reform for beginning to remedy inequality. And you will see that the first stage refers to things that can be done quickly. You might call it low-lying fruit. The idea here is we're not going to transform American society all at once. We can, however, do some things here and now that may not require the president to take action, may not require Congress to change its tune. And obviously, we're on our way to a national election. We can hope that perhaps some of the priorities in American politics change as a result of that election, but it certainly does not appear that between now and November, or really January, anything will change. And even if the election does change the composition of the federal government, that is slow-moving machinery. So what is it we could do here and now, perhaps in the absence of a sustained federal policy initiative? And then the second question is, if we were to have a change in administration, if the Congress and the president got serious about reducing inequality and the Supreme Court didn't get in the way, what kinds of policies could we adopt on a national level? Before getting into all that, I want to remind you that we were in the middle of discussing T.M. Scanlon's Why Does Inequality Matter? That Scanlon announces as a central principle of his moral philosophy, which turns on the idea that when you do something that affects somebody significantly, you have to be able to show that it accords with the principle that they could not reasonably reject. And not reasonably reject in the way that you can't reject a mugger saying money or your life. You give them your money, right? That's not reasonable, but you didn't reject the options. You did what you needed to do to save your life. As opposed to that, here we're looking for informed, unforced, general agreement. Everybody freely assenting to principles that serve to regulate their behavior when we affect each other significantly. This is the core of Scanlon's, what he calls contractualism. And he then uses his analysis, his philosophical acumen, to set out a range of reasons he thinks that lead people to reasonably reject inequality when it becomes too extreme. Some of this has to do with extreme inequality, leading to status differences, not just differences in wealth, but differences in social standing that result in forms of privilege and advantage, forms of hierarchy, of dominance and submission. And so if inequality gets to be that level, where some individuals are marked as inherently inferior, they can reasonably reject that because they will be excluded from a range of social goods and relations for no good reason other than that they lack resources, wealth, income, right? And that's not a good reason to not be allowed to be a surgeon or a teacher or a musician or whatever it is you want to do in your life, or to not have access to the full range of social relationships because you're looked down upon by those who are considered to be more desirable or more high status in your society. It's also the case that if you are in a highly unequal society, those who come out on the bottom have less control over their own lives. And here, as opposed to inequality in resources translating into status differences, it's that inequality in resources also translates into difference in power, right? And the difference in power means that some people will have more control, some people have less control over their own lives, and those who have less control will be subject to the influence of those who have more control. And again, Scanlon suggests that that's a good reason to reject inequality. So inequality is not on these accounts intrinsically objectionable, but it's objectionable because of its consequences, because of the harms it generates. Third kind of consideration like this is that equality of opportunity is impossible if there's too much inequality, and that those who have significant resource advantages will use those resource advantages to purchase further advantages for themselves or their children, and that will make it unfair in terms of the access to positions in the society. Fourth and final in this list is political fairness, that when inequality is too extreme, those who have highly concentrated wealth and large stores of income are able to exercise unequal influence on the political process. And we obviously see this in the United States today. I'll get into that in a little bit. But the core idea here is that in a democratic society, everybody should have a fair and equal opportunity to influence the outcome of political decisions. That's in essence what democracy means. And too much inequality undermines that. And that's yet another reason to reject it. So there's a second class of reasons, and these have to do not with the harm that inequality does, but with the way inequality arises. And here there are two categories of reasons. One of them has to do with the way in which institutions or groups distribute goods. And Scanlon suggests that when you join an institution or a group, you do so, you attach legitimacy to that institution or group precisely because you believe that it has equal concern for all its members. If you go to the dining hall at Atria and somebody always gets prime rib and you always get soup, and it's not because of your doctor's orders, it's just because the person serving the food likes them better than they like you, you have a justified ground for complaint, right? And similarly, when, as is the history of the United States again and again and again, white Americans get better treatment from the federal government than African Americans do, that is inherently objectionable because these are institutions that are supposed to be showing equal concern for all citizens. Finally, when economic institutions are unfair, when they pay certain people more money just because they happen to have connections, or they went to the right school, or because dad picked up the phone and talked to the boss, that is a separate instance of a kind of institutional inequality, here more an economic institution than a political institution. So with all of that in mind, then I want to get into the core of Scanlon's objection to status inequality, because I think this is very thorough and very important. And he separates the wrongs from the harms, from the objections, and puts objections into two categories. And I want to go through this very quickly. And I'm sorry to go through it quickly. I do want to get to the policy stuff. But I do think particularly in our current moment, when we've had more protests in the United States in the last couple months than we really have had at any point in recent American history, maybe at any point in American history at all, any given year. The outpouring of protests that were prompted by the killing of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police, but more broadly organized under the rubric of Black Lives Matter. And that, in a sense, have, I believe, rekindled the aspirations of the civil rights movement. And I've been reading about this, and it's absolutely clear that in 1965, 1967, 1968, both Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King Jr. were absolutely clear that, in a sense, the hardest work of the civil rights movement was in front of them, not behind them. That although they had succeeded in dismantling Jim Crow, at least legally, if not in action yet, de jure, as we say in the law, right, not de facto. Although they had succeeded in passing both civil rights and voting rights legislation, they had not yet attacked social inequality. And Johnson, in his To Fulfill These Rights speech at Howard University in 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. in various speeches, including an influential speech he gave during the Memphis sanitation workers strike, both said those civil rights landmark decisions and legislation were necessary but not sufficient. What was needed further was addressing the wealth and income gap in the United States. And as Johnson noted in 1965, the wealth gap had in fact increased, as had the income gap from 1930 to 1965, right? Not decreased, but in fact gotten substantially wider. And so I do suggest that Scanlon's analysis of the reasons to object to status inequality are extremely relevant to what's happening in America today, especially with Black Lives Matter. Now, the central claim here is that when you have too much inequality in income or wealth, it almost always translates into differences in social status and standing, into people paying attention to the way in which the amount of wealth and income you have communicate a relative social position that is deeper than just the difference in income and wealth. In a highly unequal society, people will read into what you can purchase as a result of those differences in income and wealth as a marker of how important you are, how much respect you deserve, how you should be treated, whether with deference or impudence. The whole range of the way people treat each other is affected by the level of inequality, and we need to worry about caste-like differences being introduced when inequality becomes too extreme. So what's wrong with that, right? In a sense, I'm smiling as I ask the question because I believe that we all know what's wrong. But can we be as specific and elaborate? And Scanlon suggests one thing that's wrong about it is in and of itself a form of discrimination. You are being judged and given different treatment on a basis that is irrelevant to the distribution of the good in concern, right? It doesn't matter how you dress for whether or not you should be served at a restaurant or get a table at the same pace as others who dress better than you do. But we know that this is the way things often work in a highly unequal society. So what's wrong with discrimination? First of all, the characteristics on which it's based do not justify the attitudes and differences in treatment. And so again, right, Scanlon is someone who believes that every action that significantly affects another person needs to be justifiable to them. And here you're treating people in a way that requires justification, but on a basis that does not justify the treatment. So almost automatically, this is wrong on Scanlon's account. In addition to the fact that you cannot justify the treatment, you also have to pay attention to humiliation, right? And so in addition to the fact that it's not justifiable, it is also the case that people typically have their self-respect injured when they are denied goods or treatments to which they are entitled for no other reason than that they belong to a class of persons who the society discriminates against, whether that's a poor person, a racial minority, a woman, a sexual minority, right? And we could keep going, a religious minority, an ethnic minority, a linguistic minority. If you are in that suspect or targeted group of people, you are not a candidate for friendship, often from those who are in the dominant group. The teacher in the classroom doesn't take you as seriously. If you're in a jury, your ideas are not heard with the same authority. And that's true of everyday conversations as well. And we could go on, but I hope you see the way in which this is not just that the treatment is unjustifiable. It's also that it's injurious, and not just injurious materially, injurious psychologically. It damages the person's sense of self to be treated as less than fully equal. Third, it is often the case that we tend to fabricate empirical grounds for unequal treatment. The psychological research on this is quite clear. If you ask people to attach an adjective to African American, lazy in the United States is the #1 adjective that is attached. Now, is there any empirical evidence that African Americans are lazy? Obviously not. And I hope that I don't need to make the case to you. People who have done back-breaking work for centuries in this country and who continue to put their lives on the line during a pandemic to assist the rest of us. The attribution of laziness to them clearly flies in the face of the facts, right? And yet we do, as a society, tend to associate those ideas. And we do it because we see African Americans as poor. We see them as concentrated in inner city ghettos. We see them as less well educated. And as opposed to thinking, well, maybe there are unfair social processes that generate that. There's something in the social psychological research that's called the Justus Fallacy, which is that we want to believe, we tend to believe that we live in a just world. And so if a group of people does not have opportunities, does not have income, does not have wealth, does not have educational attainment, it must be their fault. Sometimes that's called blaming the victim, right? But the wrong that Scanlon is identifying here is he thinks a extremely common psychological mechanism. Because we want to believe the world is just, so that makes it feel as if fate is not just random. It makes us seem like we have more control. If we do the right thing, if we conduct ourselves in the correct way, we will be rewarded. And if somebody is suffering or not getting ahead in life, it must be because they did something wrong. That helps the world seem more orderly, more predictable, and frankly, makes it seem like those of us who've done all right deserve our standing, and that feels good. Fourth and final wrong of discrimination has to do with the internalization of discriminatory attitudes, right? And so we see this again and again in the psychological literature. I've referred to you several times to the work by Claude Steele called Whistling Vivaldi. And in that work, he describes social evaluative threat. If you are the member of a group about whom a negative stereotype is prevalent in your society, you will tend to internalize that stereotype. And in situations that are high pressure situations where there's an important good on the line, like for instance, taking an exam to get into college, if that stereotype suggests that members of your group don't do well in that kind of activity, that stereotype being inside your head actually interferes with your capacity to do well on that activity. I think one of the things that the recent protests are helping us to see is the psychological cost, the everyday wear and tear of living in a society in which prevalent negative stereotypes circulate. They are, as Claude Steele puts it, in the air around you. And not only that, you are targeted for differential and often dangerous treatment as a result. The police profile you, they follow you, and they see you as a threat. All of that does harm to the self, to the individual, to the psychology. All right, so then let's get into some more specific harms, and I'm doing my best to be fast. I know the time is ticking away, but the harms to discrimination include denial of valued forms of employment, right? You know, if African Americans, and there's just so much history of this, are disqualified by discriminatory attitudes from positions that are high esteem, high prestige, that demand more, that have more meaning and power, authority, and creativity associated with them. It's not just the income that they've lost, it's the opportunity for fulfillment through work that has been denied. By the way, that obviously applies to women as well. I'm using African Americans as an example, but it applies to Latinos, it applies to women, it applies to others who are discriminated against. Second of all, denial of political equality. And here the history with race barely needs recounting. For the better part of 100 years, African Americans were systematically excluded from voting in the South, to the point where VOK, probably the most important political scientist of the middle of the 20th century, described the Democratic Party in the Jim Crow South as an authoritarian political party. It had no dissent. Republicans basically didn't even campaign in the South. And it completely excluded and terrorized African Americans. Third, you're denied important forms of public service. And again, that's a specific harm from discrimination. And fourth and finally, you're denied associational goods. And here I think this is a little bit more subtle. Being denied admittance to the hospital, being denied equal schools or integrated public facilities, those harms are obvious and familiar. But being denied the ability to make friends with the full range of people, being able to date or marry whoever you would like, being treated with respect by anonymous strangers on the street or at the restaurant or the bar or in the store. All of that is also harm from discrimination. It's the everyday, mundane harm that takes a cumulative toll. All right, so very quickly, the objections. First of all, people who are subject to status inequality can object because they're barred from goods and opportunities for no good reason, right? If you're going to do something that affects me, well, please explain to me why you're doing it. That's a minimum form of equal respect. If you are going to do things that dramatically decrease my life chances and my satisfaction, my well-being, don't treat me like furniture. Don't just do it to me. Tell me why you're doing it to me and try to justify it to me. And if you can't justify it to me, then you need to acknowledge what you're doing is wrong. And the consequence of that is that you should stop doing it. The second objection is being deprived of the good of being able to relate to others as equals, right? And so we see this again and again in racist language, in gender discrimination, in other forms of status hierarchy and discrimination. A group is treated as a class or caste apart and therefore automatically condescended to. And it's not just that they are therefore deprived of opportunities, wealth, income, resources, healthcare, etc. It's also that their status as equal human beings is damaged. Third, persons are led to value or disvalue their own lives for false reasons. And here, the research of Claude Steele about the way in which stereotypes get inside our heads is extremely important. And I want to just note for a moment what happens when one internalizes a stereotype. It may distort one's understanding of oneself, the kinds of priorities and goals one sets for oneself. If African Americans just aren't good at that, if Claude Steele does funny experiments where he brings out the stereotype that white men are not good at athletics, right? That white men are not as good as Asians, that women are not as good as men at math and science, right? That we artificially, if we internalize these stereotypes, close down ranges of options that might have been the most fulfilling and rewarding thing for us, right? And so we end up misvaluing or distorting our own understanding of ourselves because our society has a distorted understanding of our value, of the class of persons who we belong to, of what's possible for us. Final range of objections, and this is more narrowly to economic inequality, but to economic inequality not per se, right? Scanlon is not a leveler. He does not believe that everyone should have the same income. And one of the questions here is, what kind of differences in income do we need to generate incentives? We want the people who have truly mastered biology and physiology and have dexterity and the right kind of calm under pressure to become surgeons, right? We all benefit from that. And perhaps we need to pay more to get the people who have the relevant qualities, assuming that not a ton of them, to dedicate the time and energy, sacrifice the freedom and liberty to train for that profession. The suggestion, I think, implicit in someone like Scanlon's analysis is letting a surgeon earn 10 times as much as a nurse, letting a CEO earn 20 times as much as a worker. Well, that may be permissible. But letting them earn 100 or 200 or 300 times as much as is increasingly common in our society doesn't make any sense. And not only that, if you remember back to the work of Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, they suggest, and Scanlon agrees, that when inequality grows too large, it gets translated into status difference. The kind of car you drive, the kind of neighborhood you live in, where you take your vacation, where you send your kid to school, all of that in a more unequal society marks your place on the social ladder. In a more equal society, the rungs are closer together and the difference between them matters less. And so people pay less attention to the way status is marked by patterns of consumption that differences in income make possible. So one of the things that I think is really valuable in this work is the difference between three different kinds of poverty that Scanlon actually draws on somebody else to introduce. One of them is called subsistence poverty, right? You just don't have enough to pay the rent and the food and the doctor's bill. You've got to choose. And all those things are goods that you need. And so you're not able to get them all. And so you are clearly impoverished in the subsistence sense. But there's another way of thinking about this. If everybody in your society, let's say you're a college freshman entering school, has a nice cell phone, and your family is too poor to purchase the phone, or pay for the service, then you are excluded from the status that everybody else in your peer group holds. And so either we've got to do something to make everybody capable of having what it is that marks them as a full and equal member of society, or we've got to change our evaluative criteria. I lived in the Netherlands for a while. I was a visiting scholar at Erasmus University in Rotterdam for a year, and so I know a little bit about the way in which the Dutch manage home ownership. And almost everyone in the Netherlands owns their home. And the government gives you grants when you begin your working career to purchase the home with. And they give you long-term guaranteed mortgages. And not only that, they give you on a regular schedule loans. You just automatically qualify for them. I don't know the exact schedule, but to maintain your home, to paint it, to perhaps do other infrastructure repairs or upgrade the HVAC system, et cetera, right? The government is creating a society in which everyone can own a home. So those who live in apartments either are recent immigrants or recent graduates from college, or else have decided that that's what they would prefer. And so everybody has that same good. By the way, the homes are modest and quite similar, in part because they've decided they don't want to be in a society in which the difference between someone who owns a home and somebody who rents a home is a fundamental marker of relative social standing. And again, I think we have to recognize that that's a different kind of poverty. You might be able to pay your rent and pay your doctor's bill and also keep the lights on and eat well enough. But if you're never going to be able to buy a home, and if being a full member of your society is marked by home ownership, then you're not suffering from subsistence poverty, but you're suffering from status poverty. Third and final kind of poverty that Scanlon talks about, he refers to as agency poverty. And here you can think of the way in which the United States is organized and the difference that owning a car makes. You can actually look at these time surveys, and unless you live in the dense heart of a major metropolitan area, people who do not own cars spend much more of their time getting back and forth from work, getting groceries, taking care of other necessary errands in their life. And so it's not the case that you're not able to pay the rent. It might also not be the case that somebody looks at you and automatically knows that you don't own a car, but nevertheless, your agency in your society is impaired because you do not have one of the goods that, in a sense, your society is built on the assumption that everybody who is fully functional has. And so these are then the different reasons to object to inequality that gets to be so extreme that it turns into status inequality. So I'm going to stop for a couple minutes and give you an opportunity to ask whatever questions you might have. I'm going to unmute everybody. And who wants to start us out? Are there questions so far?
No.
So for those of you in the atrium, I can hear you. So all you got to do is talk. I believe I will hear you. No? Okay. So I don't think I'm hearing or seeing any questions yet. You do? Okay. Who's got the question? Go ahead.
Maybe you could help me with this. Our system of capitalism that determines the quality that we have, and I'm not really sure, maybe you clarify my questioning on our system of capitalism.
So I'm having a little trouble hearing you. I'm wondering if either you can get closer to the computer or the computer can get closer to you. I hear that you're asking a question about our system of capitalism, but then it gets very echoey. And so can we try one more time?
Yeah, no, it's attached to the wall, so you have to get up.
Okay. Yes.
Okay, all right, is that better?
Yes, that's much better. Go ahead.
Okay. Perhaps you could clarify this for me. I'm not too sure about this. Our system of capitalism, doesn't that in itself determine this economic equality and whatever else, we were talking about? In other words, what does this system of capitalism really indicate, if not?
Good. Okay, thank you. And that's a great question that's going to get me into the policy discussions pretty quickly. And so let me just comment very quickly that yes, we do live in a capitalist society. And in saying that, I guess we need to be as precise as possible. We let free markets handle the distribution of income, the distribution of persons across jobs. So there's a labor market, and it plays both of those functions. And then what gets produced and how much it gets sold for. So the supply of commodities is also handled by the market. And I assume by capitalism, you're referring at least to that. It also allows for significant accumulation of private wealth, and for those who have wealth to make investment decisions that determines what will be produced, right? And so when economists or sociologists speak of capitalism, that's typically what they have in mind. Having said that, there's a whole burgeoning literature, and I think it's one of the most important literatures in this field of late, on the varieties of capitalism. And so everything that I just said is true of Sweden and Norway, France, Germany, Australia, Japan, the United States, and Britain. Do those societies have similar distributions of income? Do they have similar healthcare systems? Do they have similar pension and retirement schemes? Do they have similar forms of welfare support? Absolutely not, right? And so the point is that capitalism by itself does not determine the level of equality or inequality. A few minutes ago, I was talking with you about the need to get good people as surgeons, and the fact that we may need to give them economic incentives, but that maybe earning 10 times what the nurse earns as opposed to earning 100 times what the nurse earns is a sufficient incentive. And if earning 10 times what the nurse earns gets us enough surgeons without problematic or objectionable differences in status, then maybe our tax system should make it unattractive for somebody to try to earn 50 or 100 times what the average worker earns by taxing away most of those additional earnings, right? At that point, why should I even try? If this is, by the way, what the United States was like for much of the middle of the 20th century, the 1950s, 1960s, into the 1970s. Income tax, overall tax on income of the various very highest incomes was around 80 to 90%, right? Today it's in the mid-20s to low 30s, right? So we've scaled income tax way back, which gives people incentives to want to make more. France didn't do that. And France has some problems, but guess what? The United States have some problems too. I don't think you can say that we did it right and they did it wrong. If anything, I think you might say we did it wrong and they did it right, at least in terms of taxation and its implications for inequality. So no, I wouldn't say the fact that we're a society with a market economy means that we've just got to bite the bullet and accept whatever level of inequality the market economy generates. We do have choices and we can choose to be more or less equal. We did choose to be more equal, and it turns out we actually did very well in terms of economic growth when we chose to be more equal. And so we have made choices since then to become more unequal. My suggestion is that those choices, at least in the way that an egalitarian like Scanlon or Jeremy Waldron, or I think frankly almost any respectable moral and political philosopher today would say, that those levels of inequality are not justified. They're not justified by the market. They're not justified by basic principles of justice or equal concern and respect for all persons. Thank you for the good question. I'm going to unmute again. And anybody else want to ask a question at this juncture? Okay. So if not, and I just want to make sure I'm not missing anyone, I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone again. And I'm going to continue with the lecture. I do have a few more points to cover from Scanlon, and I will do this as quickly as possible. I recognize that there's an awful lot of material in this diagram, but I just thought that it made sense to try to share with you a couple of his more concrete arguments and the parallel and structure between these arguments. Give me just one moment. I'm sorry, I have somebody at the doorbell and I'm the only one home. Be right back. Are you able to get this? I'm in the middle of giving a lecture. Oh, yeah, thank you. I have no idea, I can't see. But I'll be done in 10 minutes, okay? So sorry. It is one of the difficulties of home.
Okay, so you're unmuted.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, there is economic inequality that is accepted, but how about racial inequality? How is that affected by economic inequality?
Oh, easy.
We are talking about racial inequality, aren't we?
Well, I'm talking about both. And one of the key attributes of the United States is that racial inequality and economic inequality overlap. And I was going to talk with you a little bit more about this. Let me jump ahead and show you some of what I was going to present to you. This will almost certainly have to be mainly next week. So I was going to begin looking at segregation, right? And what we can see here, and I'll be fast about this, is the U.S. residential housing income-based segregation increased dramatically from 1970 to 2009. And so in 1970, 8.4% of the population lived in poor neighborhoods. In 2009, it's almost 20%. It's more than doubled. If we look at affluent neighborhoods, in 1970, less than 7% of people lived in affluent neighborhoods. In 2009, it's more than 15%. Similarly, we can look at middle income neighborhoods. 2/3 of the population lived in middle income neighborhoods in 1970. I don't know about you, but I lived in a middle income neighborhood in 1970. I've gone back and it's become an affluent neighborhood. Today, it's around 40%. So we've seen a 50% decrease in the number of people living in middle income neighborhoods and a 100% increase in people living in poor and affluent neighborhoods. Now, how does that relate to race? By the way, these are some of the implications. If you look at the children living in poor neighborhoods, right? It almost didn't exist in 1990, not too long ago. Today, there are huge concentrations of children. This is an area in Ohio that I just chose to illustrate this. Huge concentrations of children living in poverty. Now, this is segregation, racial segregation, not income segregation, right? And the term that sociologists use in the United States is that we are hyper segregated, right? And so the way of measuring this is a little complicated, but the areas in white have low levels of segregation, many of them because they have no diversity whatsoever. The areas in gray are segregated. They're just not extremely or hyper segregated. The areas in black are hyper segregated. And please note that these are many of the largest population centers in the United States: Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, New York City, Miami, Los Angeles, New Orleans, etc., right? There is this tremendous segregation. What this looks like in practice, this is Chicago, right? And so you can see there are large sections of South Chicago and the west side of Chicago that are over 85% Black. And then there are large sections of Chicago that are less than 10% Black, most of which tend to be around 90% white, right? And so income segregation and economic factors overlap with race a great deal. I thought I had one more slide on this, but I'm not seeing it. But yes, you're absolutely right that in the United States, when we're talking about income inequality, we always need to also be talking about racial inequality. But I want to say two more things to complicate the picture for you. One of them is that racial inequality does not exhaust income inequality. And one of the big problems in the United States, and one of the main things we've been talking about in this class, is the fact that the white working class has become much poorer, much less equal over the last 50 years. And so, right, there's an area of inequality that does not have to do with race per se. Alternatively, I think we need to be very careful to note that even when we look at the Black middle class or the Black elite, people whose incomes are higher, they are not accumulating as much wealth. They are not living in the same kind of neighborhood a white American with the same income would be living in. They're not achieving the same kind of stable mobility. And by the way, they're also often being targeted by the police for the kind of car they drive or for the neighborhood they live in, right? And so there are people who aren't African American who do poorly due to the rising inequality in our society economically. And there are African Americans who do well in terms of income, but are still victimized by racial inequality in the United States. And so although they overlap, they're not the same. They need to be pulled apart and analyzed separately from each other. I hope that helped. Do you have anything you want to follow up on or any other questions at this point?
No. Let's get on with this.
Okay, So we are down to just a couple minutes, and let me skip over to the remaining stuff from Scanlon, and when we get together next time, I'll figure out some way to give you a 1 minute synopsis. But I want to start thinking about what I'm going to call a comprehensive suite of equality promoting policy reforms that we need to recognize that the United States has become so unequal that it is threatening our democracy and what you might call our comity, our ability to get along with each other and solve our problems. And I think it's just so painfully obvious when the wearing of a mask or the taking seriously of a pandemic threat, a threat to life, to the economy, to our entire well-being as a society, is greeted not with shared purpose and resolve, but as just another polarizing issue. We have become so unequal that we're unable to solve even our most pressing problems. So we need an aggressive, comprehensive approach to policy to deal with this. But we also have a political system that is broken, that is prone to log jams and paralysis. And so one of the things I want to suggest is that we need to move in 2 stages, where the first stage would be reforms that can be accomplished without requiring ambitious federal action. And the second stage are those reforms that have to await ambitious federal action. And maybe we need to do the first to do something at the local level or the state level, or even at the level that we can control at our own workplace or our own neighborhood or the school that our children or grandchildren attend, in order to restore some functionality to our national politics. What is it that this would include? Systematic job creation. And that may sound like an ambitious national goal, and I think it is. But on the other hand, I also think that at this point, we're literally spending trillions of dollars to try to get the economy restarted. And Republicans and Democrats alike agree that this is extremely important. What form it will take, whether it would be a Green New Deal or more payrolls, support programs, I'm not sure. But it does seem to me that part of what we're seeing, if we're honest with ourselves, is that the layoffs that the first reaction to the coronavirus generated are being translated into permanent job loss now. And so we need something more than just supporting unemployment or in supporting employers and keeping their current employees. We need to be doing job creation. We also need to be doing something about affordable housing. There will be a wave of coronavirus-related evictions, starting probably next month, right? The courts will have to figure out how to handle it in an environment where it's not safe for them to operate in person. But the majority of localities in the United States put a moratorium on evictions that ends in August. And large numbers of people have fallen behind in their rent. It's estimated that maybe 10% of renters in the United States right now are behind on their rent. It's estimated that as many people are behind on their mortgage payments as were behind in the immediate buildup to the mortgage crash of 2007, 2008. We've got to do something about housing, healthcare reform. 4+ million people just lost their healthcare in the last 2 months. That's a record for any year since Obamacare was adopted. And that is another area where clearly something needs to happen, or else two things are going to happen. One is that people are not going to get the healthcare they need in the middle of a pandemic, which is going to make the pandemic worse. And the second thing is that the remaining portions of our healthcare system, the peculiar mix of employer-provided private insurance and subsidized publicly provided insurance, is going to collapse under the strain of all of these new claims during a pandemic. And the final place I'm going to focus for today and just for a minute is reform in the college admissions process. And this is near and dear to me as a college professor, and I'll just be direct and obvious about this. If you look at the most selective colleges and universities in the United States today, 60% of their students come from the 10% of the wealthiest students in the United States, right? 60% of the seats at Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, Berkeley, Michigan, etc., are taken up by the top 10%, right? The bottom 20% gets less than 7% of those seats, right? Everybody else is fighting for the remaining 40%. We need to be thinking about how to fix this. And frankly, this is not something that we need to wait for the federal government to fix. This is something that colleges and universities themselves can fix. I'll talk with you more about this next week. We have gone over a little bit. I want to stop to give you the opportunity to take the final word. Please let me know. Do you have questions, thoughts about what I've been saying to you now? I know several of you have been waiting quite a while for me to get to the policy implications. Stanley, I see your hand up.
I just wanted to make a comment, really. Thinking back when I was a kid, and I look back 50 years ago or 70 years ago, I look back at my father and my grandfather, and I could see that the world was getting better. People were working less hours, but they lived better lives. And it seems to me that should still be happening. Our productivity is probably double what it was per capita 50 years ago, but everybody is worse off, even though there's more wealth. And compared to 50 years ago, everybody could have been twice as well off as they were, and we're not. So we've been going down the wrong path for some reason. To me, it's been a big disappointment.
Yeah, thank you, Stanley, and I completely agree, and I think it's a wonderful way to synthesize a lot of what we've been talking about. And so to just put it back to you, your own idea in slightly different language, we don't have a wealth creation problem, we have a wealth distribution problem, right? Our economy has continued to grow, and to grow actually at a very healthy pace for much of the last 50 years and overall throughout that entire period. But the vast majority of that wealth has gone to the top 20% of the population. And within that top 20%, most of it has gone to the top 1% or the top 0.01%, right? And so we have a distribution problem. But I think you're absolutely right also in the way that you put it, which is to say that the idea of progress, the idea that each generation does better than the previous generation, but more generally the idea of cultural confidence. We are a progressive civilization. We're not stuck or mired in the past. We solve our problems, and as a result, things get better generation by generation, has been one of the hallmarks, one of the central contributions of American culture to the world. And at this point, 50% of the population does not believe that the next generation will do better. And they are exactly right, because fewer than 50% of the children born in the last decade seem like they are going to do better than their parents, right? And so that's a sobering and challenging situation. And I think you're absolutely right. We've got to do something about this if we are going to regain our confidence as a people, as a civilization, for the sake of decency, for the sake of justice as well. Thank you, Stanley. I know you've been waiting patiently quite a while for this portion of the conversation. I hope, well, we will continue next week. I hope you'll be satisfied with some of the ideas we have to discuss.
Yeah, I'm not done yet. We'll have more next week.
What's that? Sorry, Stanley, say it again. I accidentally muted you. Go ahead. Are you there? Okay. Does anybody else have a question or a comment at this point? All right, everybody. So please continue taking good care of yourselves. And I hope you will find that the discussion in the coming week to be much more about policy and politics. I know you're hungry for that. And so we will get into that. Take care, everybody. See you soon. Bye-bye.